I'm Mike Uyek. I love to try new things, and I've had culinary adventures all around the world, as well as right at home. I've had really wonderful food, as well as some really horrible food. I'd like to share some of my adventures with you, and we'll see if I have what it takes to fix whatever goes wrong. This is Recipe Redemption.
Greetings, Redeemers, and welcome to this episode of Recipe Redemption. A while back it occurred to me that there are a lot of people out there who just never learned some really basic survival skills during their school years. Home economics courses have faded into the mists of history in lieu of preparing students for testing in just the 3 R's, to the exclusion of all other aspects of adult life. And honestly, when I had to take home ec, I have to admit it was pretty worthless. I remember making cinnamon rolls using refrigerator biscuits. We learned how to sew a felt capital letter I that you could then affix to your Letterman's jacket if you had a Letterman's jacket. I think maybe we did a household budget, but I might be misremembering that. But that's pretty much all I remember from it. Thus, the somewhat glib suggestion that we reintroduce adulting classes to the curriculum with a focus on skills and knowledge you actually need in the modern world. How to change a tire, how to balance your checking account or do your taxes, why you don't throw that bright red sweater in a load of white underwear. Men in particular feel like we have it kind of rough. We're at a point in our society's history in which gender roles are evolving. So we're stuck with a mishmash of ideals from multiple periods in our history and no clear archetype for how a modern man is supposed to behave. And those gender roles are changing fast enough that by the time we're old enough to have kids of our own, the expectations that we place on our kids and that we teach our kids are already outdated. So what does it mean to be manly in our modern world? Masculine? Are there things a man is expected to know? And are there things a man should actively avoid knowing anything about? There was a time when a man wasn't expected to know how to heat his own dinner, but woe be to any woman who is without such lore in her toolbox. That sort of division isn't really relevant anymore. Yet there are many young men who are not expected to learn these things because of outdated parental paradigms, and go out into the world without some fairly important skills under their belts because no one thought to teach them. They're boys. Why would we even teach them how to make waffles from scratch, or how to iron their own shirts, or even why you should iron your shirts at all? This is a discussion that's far bigger than any YouTube video can address in any comprehensive way. So I'm only going to take a little nibble at it here and leave the broader discussion on sociology to others more qualified to do so than me. However, there is one topic I think I can safely discuss that relates to manliness, even in these confusing times. One skill that I think we can all agree every man should probably have mastered by the time he leaves the nest and goes off to make a life of his own. How to handle his meat. Everyone should have learned at some point how to handle their meat and know what to do with it when the time comes. Improper or unsafe practices when it comes to managing your meat can at minimum mean disappointment and embarrassment, and can be downright dangerous at worst. If you have a particularly special guest over for the evening, demonstrating a profound lack of understanding of what to do with your meat can be humiliating and can ruin the whole evening, nay, the whole weekend. It can be confusing, and there's a lot to talk about when it comes to your meat. When to massage or rub your meat. Or possibly when you may actually need to beat your meat. When it's appropriate or desired to wrap up your meat to protect it, or perhaps even tie it up with string. Or when it's okay to take it raw. Why you should rest your meat and for how long, or even how many people can enjoy your meat at the same time. I'd like to take this opportunity to discuss as many of these items as possible in about 20 minutes as a basic primer. This is not intended to be as an exhaustive treatise on meat handling, and I'm by no means a master debater when it comes to all the things you could do with your meat, but I think we can at least discuss the basics. Okay, let's get serious here. Well, a little more serious anyway. We're talking about food, of course, and in America, when you say the word meat, odds are pretty good you're talking about beef. Although some of what we're going to be talking about applies to pretty much any meat, some of it deals specifically with the cow, and it all comes down to anatomy. So let's get a little sciencey for a second. Take a second to flex a muscle or three, and think about how those muscles do what they do. Very generally speaking, the more you use a muscle, flex it, stretch it, place some strain on it, the more you develop it. If you work that muscle a lot, it gets stronger by changing its composition, by building more muscle tissue to handle heavier loads. And over many generations of doing this, evolution is going to favor individuals with more connective tissue in and amongst those muscles to handle ever heavier loads. Based on this kind of activity in the diet that the individual eats, those types of muscle are going to be leaner, generally speaking, and those longer, leaner muscle fibers and higher content of connective tissue will make those muscles tougher and chewier, culinarily speaking. So, general rule number one, muscles that do a lot of work and are attached to the biggest bones will be tougher and require different cooking methods from those that don't do as much work. So now let's take a look at a cow.
Here's a critter that spends most of its day on its feet, walking around, eating, pooping, and producing greenhouse gases. So the muscles that do the most work are the ones moving all that mass around: the legs, hips, and shoulders. So we'd expect cuts of meat from these regions to be tougher and leaner, generally speaking. And sure enough, these areas are where we get a lot of our pot roast and stew meat and cuts that need to be braised. The collagen in some of the connective tissues, when cooked at a low temperature under moist conditions for a long, slow cooking period, converts to gelatin, which when dissolved into the braising liquid, offers that rich mouthfeel that good beef stocks and soups possess. And with the breakdown of that connective tissue, the meat becomes much more tender. Those slices of pot roast that you can cut with a fork. As you move farther away from the horns and the hooves, you have muscle groups that, on average, do less work than the legs do. You don't see cows doing too many crunches or deadlifts. So here you have the ribeye and the tenderloin. Much higher fat percentage in between the muscle fibers, lower connective tissue content. These are the cuts that can be served rare and will still be tender. There's less here you have to cook out to get the texture you want. So these are arguably the best steaks. There are steaks you can get from the shoulder and butt of the cow too. There's round steak from the round, that is the hindquarters, and chuck steaks, including Denver, Sierra, and Clod steaks from the leg, shoulder, and neck area. But they're going to be stringier. That's typically why they're cheaper cuts than a filet mignon from the loin or a ribeye from the ribs. Sirloin is a popular cut that sort of straddles the two extremes. It comes from the hip area on the cow and has a bit more connective tissue than the tenderloin, but not quite as much as the round. The round has a decent amount of fat content, so although it doesn't make the best steaks, it's good as a component of ground beef. It's mixed with ground chuck in different proportions to produce ground beef of differing fat contents, and because flavor-wise it brings different things to the table from what chuck alone has to offer. When chopping for beef, you need to keep this anatomy lesson in mind. The right cut for you depends on what you intend to do. Long, slow stewing and simmering, you want tougher stuff with more connective tissue. So chuck roasts are a great way to go for braised dishes like beef bourguignon, pot roast, and stews. Roast beef, if you're budget-minded, round roasts are a decent way to go. Or if you're feeling flush, you could get a hunk of ribeye. Although it doesn't need the longer, slower cook time that a round roast does, all that fat content basically means it has a little bit of protection from drying out while roasting, and can make for a very tender, juicy sliced beef. Why do you think it's so popular at wedding buffets? Ossobuco practically calls for the toughest stuff on the boniest parts of the critter. You can either get beef shanks, basically thick cross sections of the lower legs, including the bones, or you can go straight for the oxtails, usually the top few tail vertebrae, which are surprisingly good eating, if a bit of work.
Steaks, as we mentioned, are typically best from the tenderloin and rib area. But if you're on a budget, you can get chuck or round steaks for significantly cheaper if you keep in mind why they're cheaper. The fat isn't marbled throughout the steak, but comes in kind of bigger fat caps that aren't as nice to eat. And the connective tissues can make them tough, and in some cases can actually warp the shape of your steak as they cook and shrink up under high heat. You'll see shank steaks that are like this that have a lot of connective tissue that actually pulls the steak apart as you cook it if you try to cook it as a steak. If you get an immersion circulator or sous vide device, it can be a really good way to go with these tougher steaks. By heating the steak up to around 115 Fahrenheit and holding it there, it's like a low and slow braise, especially if you put it in a bag with some herbage and butter, and then finish by searing for just a minute over a screaming hot grill on our cast iron skillet. Some of that connective tissue will have had time to convert to gelatin and make the meat more tender, while not getting so hot that they shrivel and pull the meat into some sort of modern sculpture. Loin steaks are also a decent compromise. High on the cow, not quite to the round. This is where your T-bone and porterhouse steaks come from, which are quite tasty, if a little fiddly to eat, and nowhere near as melt in your mouth good as something from the rib and loin. So you've narrowed down your choice of cut to the type of meat you want. And now it comes down to how you want to cook it. Rules number 2 and 3 deal with the thermodynamics of this. Number 2 is, the larger the hunk of beast, the longer it's going to take for heat to make it into the center.
Think of any piece of meat like a Russian nesting doll. An infinite number of layers, each one inside the next, all insulating the layers within from the heat you're trying to force into it from without. The larger the steak or roast, the more of these layers it has, and the more work you're going to have to do to get those layers heated. So if you've got a big roast or a particularly thick cut of steak, you have to realize that even though you may have a really tender cut of meat, you're going to have to take extra care to cook it all the way through without overcooking it. If you just drop a 4-inch thick slab of meat in a ripping hot pan and just leave it there until it's medium rare in the center, there's a good chance it's going to be tough as an old boot on the outside where it contacted the pan by the time the center gets cooked or even heated beyond the 40 degrees Fahrenheit it was in the fridge.
For really thick steaks or large roasts, you have a few choices. You can choose to cook it low and slow so that the entire mass has a chance to sort of coast up to the right temperature. The outer layers will end up a little more well done than the inner ones, but you might not get that nice sear you want on the steak. You can change the surface to mass ratio by cutting the roast or steak into thinner slices, like butterflying it or slicing it into minute steaks. Or you can treat your steak like a roast and do a 2-stage cooking process by searing it at a high temperature and then placing it in an oven at a relatively low temperature to allow the internal temp to coast up to the final doneness. Rule number 3 is kind of a corollary to number 2, but it is important to consider. Meat on the bone takes longer to cook than meat without bones. Bone is pretty dense stuff, and thermodynamically speaking, the denser something is, the more work it takes to heat that material.
So the virtual layers of meat we're talking about that happen to be close to a bone is going to be cooled by that bone and therefore take longer to cook than the meat further away. That's why it's possible to have a bone-in roast be almost well done on the outside and be virtually raw next to the bone.
You've got that heat sink that's stealing a lot of the heat that could have gone to cooking the center of the roast. So anything with a bone in the middle will also require at least some low temperature cook time to cook everything through. And the larger the bone, the more care you need to take. Rule number 4 is absolutely essential you learn about meat. Rest your meat, always. And the bigger piece of meat, the longer it needs to rest. This is after cooking.
Take another look at our layers of steak. As you blast this hunk of meat from the outside with heat, the heat slowly moves inward through the layers of steak.
As it does so, it causes all the moisture in the layers it passes through to expand, creating a lot of internal pressure inside the meat. If you snatch that steak right out of the pan and immediately slice into it, all that pressure has to go somewhere, and all the juices in the steak come leaking out onto your plate. Obviously not ideal. All that moisture, juiciness, leaking out of your steak is not going to end up in you. And you could be left with a much drier steak than you wanted, even if you did everything else right as far as cooking it. Taking the steak out of a hot pan and setting it to the side with a piece of foil over it for 5 or 10 minutes allows all that heat energy to equalize across the entire thing. The internal pressure eases, the juices redistribute throughout the meat so that by the time you do slice into it, the juices are just sitting there rather than fighting to escape, and you end up with a much juicier bite. Resting also allows carryover cooking to do its thing. Even after you take your beast out of the oven or pan, the outer layers are hotter than the inner ones, and that heat is going to continue to work its way inwards for some time until all the layers reach equilibrium. If you have an electronic thermometer, you can watch it happen. You pull your roast out of the oven when it's reading a nice 120 degree Fahrenheit rare temperature, and it'll coast up another 5 degrees while you watch. Really big roasts, like a whole prime rib roast or a large turkey, can rest for up to half an hour and could coast up as much as 15 degrees in that time. So if you learn absolutely nothing else from me, learn this. Rest your meat, always. Okay, so let's put your new meat IQ to the test. You say, all right, I know everything now about how to cook beef. Any cut, any style, whatever. And I say, okay, smarty, cook that. This is 2.6 pounds, excuse me, of beef, ribeye, bone in. What they call a tomahawk steak, because it sort of looks like a tomahawk, I guess. So 2 pounds, 2.6 pounds, it's 42 ounces of meat with bone. How would you cook that? Now let's take a look at how thick that is. That is just a little bit under 3 inches thick. It's a good bit of fat there. It's ribeye. So let's think about this for a moment. I guess I'll hold it up. So, ribeye comes from middle of the critter. Fairly tender, got a good bit of fat, both intra as well as intermuscular fat. It's on the bone, so that's going to affect the cooking time. Like I said, it's tender and has a lot of fat, so you're going to want fast, high heat cooking. Cook it like a steak. However, big and heavy, lots of mass to the surface area that you're talking about. Surface to mass ratio fairly low. So heat is not going to penetrate very well into the center of that if we just put it over 800 degree heat for a few minutes each. It's going to be a nice good brown sear on the outside, and it may very well be cold on the inside. So we need to think about this. How are we going to cook this to the medium rare to rare that you're going to want it to be? Low and slow, then hot, right? We're going to want, if you have a sous vide, is a perfect application for sous vide is this. Or what they call an immersion circulator. Basically, you vacuum seal this in a plastic bag, immerse it in water that you have this immersion circulator or sous vide device. And what it does is it circulates the water so you have convection around the bag, and it maintains it at a specific temperature. So you wrap it up, you'd probably set it for 125 degrees Fahrenheit and just let it sit there for probably about 4 hours. And it slowly brings the entire thing up to temperature. It takes it in 125 is a little bit low. You really want it about 130, 135 for a nice medium rare. But take it to 125, and because you've gone nice and slow on this immersion circulator, the entire thing all the way through to the center will be 125, perfectly, just under rare. Then you cut open the bag, toss this into a rip-roaring hot pan just to sear the outside and get that nice crust that you actually want. And that will take it the rest of the way to rare or medium rare, however you like it. We're going to do the same sort of thing, but in the oven. I'm going to set my oven for like 170, that's as low as it goes, 170 degrees. Wrap this in foil with some salt and some pepper, and stick it in the oven for a couple of hours at 170 degrees. That will take this up to, again, probably around 125 degrees in the center by the time 2 hours has passed. Then I'm going to take it out and I'm going to sear it right at the very end just to get that nice texture, and it should be perfect. Let's put this to the test.
Well, here we go. Going to start off with some heavy-duty aluminum foil on a sheet pan. I'm just going to put a little olive oil on there and brush it around so the meat won't stick to it. And speaking of which, here's the star of the show, placed right in the center with a pinch of kosher salt and a few grinds of black pepper. Don't be too shy about it either. Then I want it to taste good on both sides, like Emerald says, so I'm going to repeat on the other side. Then I'm just going to wrap it up in the foil, more or less tight, and I'm leaving one end open here so I can insert my probe thermometer, and then I'm going to crimp the foil up around the thermometer probe. And after 1.5 hours at 250 degrees, the internal temperature shows just above 125 in the center. So I'm going to unwrap it, and look at that. It's almost cooked, but not quite. So here I have my best cast iron pan, and I'm going to get that nice final sear. It's only going to spend maybe 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes on each side just to get a nice sear on the outside. And since that bone prevents some of the steak from actually contacting the pan, like ever, I'm going to use my handy little kitchen torch to kind of give a little char on the parts that don't actually touch the pan. Guess I didn't mention that I lubed the steak before I put it in the pan, and I'm going to lube this side as well. After all, you don't want it to stick. And then 2 minutes have passed. Flip my big beast over. And look at that. That's not a bad color there. Once again, using the torch to kind of do a once over on the parts of the steak that didn't actually touch the pan. And in the last minute, I'm going to throw some butter and some chopped garlic. Yes, I'm using some store-bought stuff. Don't judge me. Now as the butter melts, kind of want to move it around the pan, and yes, don't forget to use oven mitts with a cast iron pan because that handle will be hot. And don't be lazy like me. Actually open the drawer that is a foot away and get out a spoon and spoon all this garlic butter over the top of the steak, rather than trying to use tools for their not for their intended purposes. That's going to deliver one additional shot of flavor. Now take the steak out onto a plate, cover with foil, and rest it for 10 minutes. But you got this nice hot pan with garlic butter in it. Seems a shame not to use it with some Brussels sprouts. And after tossing those in the garlic butter and letting them cook for a few, adding a little bit of red wine to help kind of break some of the fond off the bottom of the pan and add a little extra flavor component. Toss to coat and continue cooking for a few more minutes, and then season with salt, a little bit of garlic powder and onion powder, and you're ready to serve. And now, the moment of truth. If I've rested this long enough, it shouldn't bleed out when I slice it. And yeah, not a whole lot of juices leaking out onto the counter. Got a nice sear on the outside. It's cooked but still pink in the middle, which is a nice rare the way I like it. It's tender, it slices easily. Just about perfect.
So that's how you impress your guests. Because, I mean, how was it? Come on, you saw it. Daddy got nasty. If you treat your meat properly, season simply, salt, pepper. If you want a little bit onion powder, garlic powder, fine. Finish with butter in the pan and rest your meat. Always remember, rest your meat. And it will come out great every time. So, until next time, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode of Recipe Redemption. Bye now. Get your own.